The dog would not move from the door. Nurses stepped around him, an orderly nudged him with the side of a cart, and a woman with a clipboard asked twice whether the animal belonged to anyone. He stayed where he was, a 100-pound German shepherd lying flat across the threshold of room 311, chin on his paws, eyes fixed on the closed door as though something inside it owed him an answer. The man who owned him stood at the end of the hallway with a paper cup of coffee going cold in his hand. He had no idea who was in that room. He had brought the dog here for an entirely different reason, and now the dog had chosen a stranger. His name was Daniel Okafor, and 3 days earlier he had not planned to be in this town at all. He was 39 years old, broad through the shoulders in a way that made hallways feel narrow, with a short crop of black hair going gray at the temples, and a flat, watchful face that did not give much away. A pale seam of scar tissue ran along the left side of his jaw, an old souvenir from a deployment he rarely talked about. He had spent 11 years in the Marine Corps, and 4 of them training dogs, and the last of those dogs, the one lying across the doorway now, was named Bishop. Bishop was a working-line shepherd, dark saddle over a tan body, with tall ears that never seemed to rest, and amber eyes that took in everything. He had served 2 tours and come home with a limp that showed only in the cold. Daniel had adopted him the day the Corps retired him, and the 2 of them had been moving ever since, town to town, job to job, never staying long enough for anyone to learn their names. If you have ever loved a creature that seemed to understand more than it should, stay with this story, because the dog at that door knew something none of the people in the building had figured out yet. And if it moves you the way these stories are meant to, consider subscribing and staying until the end. Daniel had come to Cedar Falls for the simplest reason a man can have. He needed work, and a fencing contractor north of town had answered his message. The job was 3 weeks of post holes and wire across a horse property, cash at the end, no questions about where he had been. He had parked his truck behind the feed store, slept in the cab 2 nights with Bishop curled in the passenger seat, and on the 3rd morning the dog had started limping worse than usual. That was why they were at the hospital. Not the hospital, exactly. There was a veterinary clinic 2 doors down that shared a parking lot with the county medical center, and Daniel had taken Bishop there to have the leg looked at. Vet had pressed along the old injury, said it was inflammation and nothing worse, and sent them out with a small bottle of pills and instructions to rest the leg for a week. They had been walking back across the shared lot when Bishop stopped. He stopped the way he used to stop in the field. All at once, weight dropping low, ears swinging toward the tall brick building that was not the clinic. Daniel had felt the leash go tight and then go still. He knew that stillness. He had trusted his life to it more than once. Bishop was not reacting to a smell or a sound a dog might chase. He had locked on to something, and he was asking, in the only language he had, to follow it. Daniel had learned a long time ago not to argue with that. So he let the dog lead him through the automatic doors of the county medical center, past a startled volunteer at the front desk, down a corridor that smelled of bleach and old coffee, until Bishop turned a corner, walked halfway down the 3rd-floor hallway, and lay down across the door of room 311. And there he stayed. The volunteer caught up, flustered, saying animals were not allowed past the lobby. Daniel apologized and reached for the leash, and Bishop, who had obeyed him through gunfire, did not move. The dog looked up at him once, a long, steady look, then turned his eyes back to the door. That was the first time in 4 years Bishop had ever refused him. A nurse came, a heavy-set woman in her 50s, with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair and a name tag that read Pauline. She started to repeat the rule about animals. Then she looked at the dog, really looked. and something in her face changed. She crouched, slow, the way careful people crouch near a strange dog, and she let Bishop smell the back of her hand. "He picked this room," she said. It was not a question. "He picked this room," Daniel agreed. Pauline straightened and looked at the closed door for a moment. "There's a man in there. Nobody's claimed," she said quietly. "Came in 4 days ago. Found out by the river road. No wallet, no phone, nothing on him but the clothes he was wearing. He hasn't woken up enough to tell us his name." Daniel looked down at Bishop. The dog's tail moved once against the floor, slow, and went still again. "You know him?" Pauline asked. "Never seen him in my life," Daniel said. "Neither has the dog. We've never been to this town." Pauline did not answer that. She seemed to be turning something over. Then she said, "Come on, you can't leave him in the hall, and I can't make him leave. Let's see what he does." She opened the door. The room was dim, the blinds half drawn against the gray morning. A man lay in the bed, older, somewhere past 70, with a face gone thin and a week of white stubble. Tubes ran to his arm, and the monitor ticked his heartbeat into the quiet. His eyes were closed. He looked like a man the world had already started to set down. Bishop rose. He crossed the room without hurry, set his front paws against the rail of the bed, and lowered his head until his nose nearly touched the old man's hand, where it lay open on the blanket. Then he made a sound Daniel had heard only a handful of times in all their years together. Not a bark, not a whine. A low, broken rumble deep in the chest, the sound a dog makes when something it has lost is suddenly close enough to smell. The old man's fingers moved. It was the smallest thing, 2 fingers curling a half-inch toward the dog's muzzle. But Pauline drew a sharp breath behind them, and the monitor changed its rhythm, and Daniel felt the hair rise along his arms. The old man had not responded to voices in 4 days. The nurses had told the doctors he was slipping. And a stranger's dog had walked into the room and pulled his hand half off the blanket. "Get the doctor," Pauline said, and a younger nurse already standing in the doorway turned and ran. Daniel pulled a chair close and sat. He did not know why. He had planned to be 3 weeks at a fence line, and then gone the way he was always gone, and instead he was sitting beside a sleeping stranger with his hand resting on the back of a dog who would not leave. Outside, the gray morning pressed against the glass. Inside, something had started that he did not yet understand and could not have walked away from if he tried. The doctor who came was a tired young man named Reyes, who checked the old man's eyes with a penlight and frowned at the monitor and said the response was real, faint, but real, the first he had shown. He did not pretend to explain it. He looked at the dog the way a scientist looks at a result he cannot reproduce, and then he looked at Daniel. "He's yours. The dog is the man." "I don't know him." "Well," Reyes said, "your dog just did something we couldn't." "I'd take it as a good sign." They let Bishop stay. There was no rule that covered a thing like this, and Pauline, it turned out, had been a nurse for 26 years and had stopped believing rules covered everything a long time ago. She brought a folded blanket for the floor and a bowl of water, and Bishop lay down beside the bed with his chin on the mattress, and did not take his eyes off the old man's face. Daniel spent that first night in the chair. It was a hard vinyl thing, the color of old mustard, and it did not recline, and his back found every wrong angle in it within an hour. He told himself he would leave in the morning. The fencing job would not wait, and a man who had nothing could not afford to lose 3 weeks of cash for a stranger. He worked it out in his head a dozen times, the practical math of it. The diesel he would burn driving out, the cash he would lose, the room he could not rent, and every time he reached the same answer, and every time he looked at the dog and did not get up. Around midnight, a night nurse named Carla came to check the lines moving soft in rubber soles, and she stopped when she saw the dog stretched along the floor with his chin on the mattress. She did not tell Daniel the rule. She had clearly already heard it from Pauline. She just stood a moment, watching the rise and fall of the old man's breath and the way the dog's ear tracked it, and then she said, almost to herself, 20 years I've worked nights. I've seen people hold on for the strangest reasons. She wrote something on the chart and went out, and the door side shut behind her, and the room settled back into the tick of the monitor and the low whistle of the heat vent. Daniel watched the old man's face in the green glow of the machines. He looked for something in it, some thread that would explain why a dog who had crossed deserts at his heel would cross a parking lot to lie down here. He found nothing he could name, just an old man's face, fallen in around the cheekbones and a week of white stubble, and a small, steady pulse ticking in the hollow of his throat. Bishop sighed once, a long, settling sound, and laid his weight more firmly against the bed, and the old man's breathing seemed to find that rhythm and follow it down into something deeper than before. Years of leaving had trained him to leave. Something about that room was doing the opposite. Morning came gray again. A volunteer brought him coffee. He had not asked for. Pauline came on shift and told him quietly that the night nurses had charted 3 more small movements, all of them when the dog shifted or sighed, as if the old man's body were tuned to the animal across some frequency the machines could read, but not name. By afternoon, the old man's eyes had opened twice, unfocused, drifting, closing again. By evening, they opened and found the dog and stayed there a long moment before they closed. On the 3rd morning, he spoke. His voice was a dry husk of a thing, barely above the hum of the monitor, and what he said was a single word. He said, "Scout." Daniel leaned in. What was that? The old man's eyes moved to him, then back to the dog. His cracked lips worked. "Scout," he said again, and one thin hand lifted off the blanket and laid itself, trembling, on the top of Bishop's head. The dog went absolutely still under it, the way he went still for almost no one. "There you are," the old man whispered. "There you are." Daniel did not correct him. He could not have explained why. There was a thing happening in that room that ran deeper than a wrong name, and he had learned to wait on things he did not understand. The man's name, they learned over the next 2 days, was Henry Calloway. It came back to him, in pieces, the way a flooded road comes back as the water drops. He was 73. He had lived alone out past the river road, on a few acres he had worked most of his life, and he had gone into the ditch in his old truck on a night of black ice and lain there longer than a man his age should have survived. A county crew had found the truck. They had nearly missed the man, who had crawled some distance from it before the cold took his legs out from under him. He remembered almost none of that. What he remembered, what he kept circling back to, was a dog named Scout. "Best dog the Army ever wasted on a quartermaster," Henry said on the 4th afternoon, stronger now, propped up against the pillows with Bishop's head still resting on the edge of the bed. "I wasn't supposed to keep him. He was government property. They were going to put him down when his hips went. 60 years ago, that was. And I drove him off post in the bed of a borrowed truck and never gave him back." He looked at Bishop with eyes that had gone wet and unembarrassed. "This one's got his exact way of looking at you, like he's already decided about you and he's just waiting to see if you'll catch up." Daniel knew that look. He had spent 4 years on the other end of it. He should have left by then. The fencing contractor had called twice and stopped calling. The cash was gone, given to another man with a clearer schedule and no dog asleep on a hospital floor. Daniel had perhaps $200 left and a truck that drank oil, and he had spent 5 days doing nothing that paid. He knew the arithmetic of his own life better than he knew anything, and the arithmetic said, move. He did not move. He told himself it was the dog. He was beginning to suspect it was more than the dog. Stay with this, because the part of the story that mattered most had not arrived yet, and it arrived wearing a good coat and a careful smile. The man came on the 6th day. He was somewhere in his 40s, smooth-shaven, in a charcoal overcoat that had no business in a county hospital, and he carried a slim leather folder under one arm. He introduced himself to Pauline at the desk as a representative of a company called Meridian Land Partners, and he said he was there on behalf of Mr. Calloway's interests, and he smiled the entire time he said it. Bishop was on his feet before the man reached the door. The dog did not bark. He simply stood, square and silent, in the middle of the room between the bed and the door, with his weight forward and his ears flat, and a stillness in him that was worse than any growl. Daniel had seen that stillness exactly twice before, both times moments before something went very wrong. He stood up, too. The man in the overcoat stopped in the doorway and looked at the dog and kept smiling, though the smile had gone tight at the edges. "Quite an animal," he said. "I'm here to see Mr. Calloway. I represent some parties with an interest in his property. There are time-sensitive matters." "He just woke up," Daniel said. "He doesn't need a meeting." "And you are?" "The one with the dog." The man's eyes moved to Bishop and away. "I'll keep it brief," he said, and he stepped into the room, and Bishop's lip lifted off his teeth without a sound. The man stopped again. He set the leather folder on the rolling tray table, opened it with 2 fingers, and turned it so Henry could see. "Mr. Calloway, good to see you recovering. I won't take much of your time. We have an agreement to finalize. Your signature here releases the lien and lets us proceed with the purchase we discussed in the fall." Henry blinked at the page. His thin face had gone careful. "I don't recall any agreement," he said. "You signed a letter of intent in October," the man said smoothly. "You were quite eager, given the back taxes. We've been more than patient. The county sale is scheduled, and frankly, this signature is the only thing standing between you and losing the land for nothing. We're offering you something. Surely that's better than the alternative. It was a good performance." The numbers came easy off his tongue, the back taxes, the deadline, the favor he was doing. The folder looked official. The pen he set beside it looked expensive. And it was all aimed at a man who had been unconscious 4 days earlier and could not remember his own truck going into a ditch. Daniel had seen this shape before in other towns, worn by other men. Not the same scheme, never the same scheme, but the same shape. Pressure, dressed as kindness. A clock that only the predator could see. "He's not signing anything today," Daniel said. "With respect, this isn't your concern. Unless you're family. Are you family? No. Then I'd ask you to step aside." Bishop took 1 step forward. It was a small step, deliberate, and it put the dog squarely between the folder and the bed. The man in the overcoat looked down at him, and for the first time the smile failed entirely. He gathered the folder, slow, careful of his hands, and he said to Henry in a voice that had cooled several degrees, "The sale is in 11 days, Mr. Calloway. After that, no one can help you. Not your friends, not your animal." He looked at Daniel. "Think about what's best for him." Then he left, and the room let out a breath it had been holding, and Henry's hand was shaking on the blanket. Daniel picked up the pen the man had left behind and looked at it and set it back down. "Tell me about the land," he said. What Henry told him over that evening and the next morning came out slow and ashamed, the way these things come out of proud men. He had fallen behind on the property taxes 2 winters running, after his wife passed and the medical bills ate what little he had set by. A man had come to the house last fall, friendly, full of solutions, and talked about a way to settle the taxes and keep a life estate, words Henry only half understood. There had been papers. He had been tired and frightened and alone, and he had signed something, he was not sure what. He had not heard from them again until today. "How much are the back taxes?" Daniel asked. "Little over 11,000, Henry said. "Might as well be 11 million. I've got $40 in a coffee can and a truck in a ditch. And the land's worth, what?" Henry was quiet a moment. "My grandfather cleared it," he said. "There's a spring on it, never goes dry. 40 acres of bottom land a developer's been sniffing at for years. It's worth a great deal more than $11,000, son. They know that. That's the whole game. They pay the taxes, they take the deed, and what I get to keep is the right to die in the house before they bulldoze it." Daniel sat with that. Outside the window, the gray had finally broken, and a hard, clean winter light lay across the parking lot and the river beyond it. He thought about the fence job he had lost, and the $200 in his pocket, and the long habit of leaving that had kept him safe and kept him empty for years. He thought about a soldier 60 years gone who had driven a condemned dog off a post in a borrowed truck, because some things were worth more than the rules that governed them. 11 days, Daniel said. 11 days, Henry agreed, and he closed his eyes, and his hand found the top of Bishop's head, and the dog leaned into it. Daniel did not sleep that night. He sat in the chair with a notepad a nurse had given him, and he made the kind of list he used to make before an operation, and somewhere around 2 in the morning he understood that he had already decided to stay. Not 3 weeks. Longer. The decision did not arrive as a feeling. It arrived as a plan, which was the only way decisions had ever arrived for him, and the plan needed 3 things he did not have: money, proof, and people. He found the people first, because Pauline knew the town. She had worked the county hospital for 26 years, and she had watched men in good coats come through those doors before, carrying folders, smiling at the old and the alone. There was a widow out on the East Line Road 2 years back, she told him over coffee in the staff break room, her voice low. Same kind of fellow. Same kind of folder. She signed, and within a year there was a storage lot where her orchard had been. Nobody ever proved a thing. Nobody knew where to look. She wrapped both hands around her mug. If somebody had stood up for her, I think it might have gone different. I've thought about that woman more than once. I'm going to need names, Daniel said. People who knew Henry before. People who'd vouch for what he can and can't remember. Pauline started writing on a napkin. The names led to a feed store owner named Ruth Delgado, 61, sharp as a tack, who had sold Henry his chicken feed for 30 years and called him a stubborn old fool with real affection. They led to a retired county clerk named Sam Whitlock, who had processed deeds in that office for 3 decades and knew exactly how a tax sale was supposed to work and exactly how it could be bent. And they led 2 days later to a Marine. His name was Theo Brandt, 64, a Vietnam-era veteran who ran a small welding shop on the edge of town and walked with a cane from a hip that had quit on him years before. Daniel had not gone looking for him. Theo had heard, the way small towns hear, that a young Marine with a war dog was sitting up nights at the county hospital for a man with no family, and he had driven over on a cold morning with a thermos of coffee and a folding chair and announced that he intended to make himself useful. "You don't know, Henry," Daniel said. "I know the kind of thing that's being done to him," Theo said, lowering himself into the folding chair with a grunt. "Did 2 tours, so men like that one in the overcoat could feel safe doing it in a clean office instead of out in the open. Figure, I'm allowed to object." He looked at Bishop, who had come to sniff his boots, and then settled beside the chair, as if he had always belonged there. "Good dog." "He picked the old man?" "He picked him." "Then the old man's worth picking," Theo said. And that was the end of the discussion. They built it slowly, the way you build anything that has to hold weight. Sam Whitlock pulled the public record on the tax delinquency and the scheduled sale, and what he found made his jaw tighten. The back taxes were real, a little over 11,000, just as Henry had said. The sale itself was the problem. It had been advertised in a way Sam called sloppy at best and crooked at worst. The legal notice run in a paper across the county line where no one in Cedar Falls would see it. The redemption period calculated short by what Sam was fairly sure was a deliberate misreading of the statute. And the buyer of record, the company poised to take the deed, was Meridian Land Partners. "Here's the thing they're counting on," Sam said, spreading the printouts across Henry's tray table while the old man watched. "They're counting on him being alone, broke, and confused. They're counting on no one with a clock and a clear head standing between him and that sale date. A tax sale can be redeemed. The owner can pay the back taxes any time before the sale is final and keep his land free and clear. They just made it as hard as possible for him to know that, and they put a clock on it. And they're hoping he signs their paper out of fear before he ever finds out he had a way out the whole time. So we pay the taxes," Daniel said. "So somebody pays the 11,000 before the sale closes," Sam said. "And it's clean, and the overcoat goes home with nothing. $11,000. Daniel had 200. He sat with the number that night and felt the old familiar urge to walk, because this was the point where a sensible man admitted the problem was bigger than he was. He looked at Henry, asleep with his hand fallen open toward the dog, and he looked at Bishop awake and watching the door. And he did not walk. He did the thing he had spent his whole life avoiding. He asked for help. It started smaller than he expected and grew faster than he believed. Ruth Delgado put a coffee can on the counter of the feed store with Henry's name on a card taped to the front and told every farmer who came through what was being done to a man they all knew. Theo Brandt made some calls to the Veterans Post, 2 towns over, men who understood without much explanation what it meant for one of their own to be quietly robbed. Pauline talked to the hospital chaplain, who talked to 2 churches. Sam Whitlock wrote a plain account of how the sale had been advertised and walked it into the county newspaper, the one inside the county line, and a reporter who had been looking for exactly this kind of story for a long time started making calls of her own. The overcoat had counted on Henry being alone. Henry was not alone anymore. The money came in the way. Money comes in small towns, slow, and then all at once. $20 from a man who could spare 20, 200 from a church that took up a collection, a check from the Veterans Post that made Theo go quiet when he read the amount. Ruth Delgado worked the front of her feed store like a campaign headquarters. She knew every farmer in 3 townships by their feed order and their grandchildren's names, and when they came through her door, she did not ask them for money so much as she told them what was happening, plainly leaning on the counter, with her reading glasses down her nose, and let the telling do the work. A wheat farmer named Pruitt, who had not spoken to Henry in a decade over some forgotten fence line argument, laid $200 on the counter and said, "Only old fool would do it for me," and walked out before Ruth could thank him. The coffee can on the feed store counter filled and was emptied into a real account that Sam set up so everything could be accounted for in daylight, every dollar tracked, nothing that anyone could ever call a trick. Sam Whitlock kept the ledger himself in a cloth-bound book, in the small, careful hand of a man who had spent 30 years making records that would survive him. He wrote down every name and every amount, and when a woman pressed a folded 10 into his hand at the grocery and asked to stay anonymous, he wrote down the 10 and, in the name column, the word friend. Theo Brandt drove out to the Veterans Post, 2 towns over, on a Thursday night and stood up in front of 24 men in a cinder-block hall that smelled of coffee and old cigarette smoke, and he did not make a speech. He had never been able to make a speech. He just said that one of theirs, by which he meant Daniel, was standing watch over an old man who was being robbed, and that the old man had no one, and that he, Theo, intended to help, and would think more of any man in the room who did the same. Then he sat down. The post commander passed a helmet around the room the old way, and what came back in it, counted out on a folding table under a bare bulb, made Theo set his jaw and look at the wall for a moment before he could speak again. By the 8th day, they had a little over 6,000. By the 10th, they had 9. They were 2,000 short with 1 day to go. Daniel stood in the parking lot that night, in the cold, Bishop beside him, and looked at the lit window of room 311 and let himself feel, for 1 minute, the full weight of how close they were and how far. $2,000. After everything. He had not prayed in a long time, was not sure he knew how anymore, but he stood there in the dark and said something close to it. The last of the money came from a direction no one expected. The reporter's story had run that morning, on the front page inside the county line, a plain and damning account of how Meridian Land Partners had advertised a tax sale where the owner could not find it, and put a clock on a frightened old man. It named the company. It described the pattern. The widow on the East Line Road, the orchard turned to a storage lot. And it was read that morning by a man named Gerald Voss, who owned the hardware store and 3 rental properties, and who had 2 years earlier nearly sold his late mother's house to the same company before something about the man in the overcoat had made him walk away. Gerald Voss came to the hospital at noon with a cashier's check for the balance and a look on his face like a man paying off an old debt to himself. "I almost let them do it to my mother's place," he said, pressing the check into Daniel's hand, "walked away, and never said a word to anybody, never warned a soul, told myself it wasn't my business." He looked toward the door of 311. "Reading that this morning, I figured, maybe it was my business after all. Maybe it always was. They had it. With 1 day to spare, they had all of it." Sam Whitlock walked the full amount into the county treasurer's office the next morning, the morning of the sale, with Daniel and Theo beside him and the reporter watching, and he paid the back taxes on Henry Calloway's 40 acres in full, 11,000 and change. And he got a stamped receipt and a certificate of redemption that meant the land was Henry's, free and clear, and no tax sale could touch it. The clerk at the window, who had grown up in that county, smiled when she stamped it. The man in the overcoat did not appear at the sale. There was nothing for him to buy. Meridian Land Partners, it turned out, did not do well with daylight. When the reporter called the number on their letterhead for comment, no one answered, and within a week, the office 2 counties over had cleared out, the name peeled off the door. The widow on the East Line Road got a knock from the same reporter, and for the first time, someone who would listen. The pattern that had run quiet for years had been dragged into the light, and the light did to it what light does. There was no dramatic confrontation. There never is with men like that. They do not fight when they are exposed. They simply go and find a county where no one has heard their name yet. And that is its own kind of justice, the kind that protects the next old man as much as it vindicates this one. Henry Calloway went home 11 days after the dog first lay down across his door. He could not go back to the house alone. Not yet, with his legs still unsteady and the long winter not done. So for a while he did not go home so much as the town brought home to him. Theo Brandt and 2 men from the veterans' post pulled Henry's old truck out of the ditch with a chain and a borrowed tractor on a morning cold enough to make the metal bite their hands, and when the engine caught on the 3rd try and idled rough and then smoothed out, one of the younger men let out a whoop that startled a flock of starlings off the wire. Then they started on the house. The porch step that had been broken for a year, the gutter hanging loose along the north eave, the woodpile gone low against a winter that was not finished with them. Daniel found that Henry's tools were good ones, kept oiled and sharp, the tools of a man who had built things with his hands his whole life, and using them felt like a conversation with someone he was only beginning to know. Ruth Delgado organized meals the way she organized everything, with a clipboard and no patience for argument. She assigned days and dishes, and would not hear that anyone was too busy. A casserole appeared on Henry's counter every evening for 2 weeks, and a loaf of bread, and once a whole pie, from a woman Henry swore he had never met, which made him laugh, the first real laugh anyone had heard out of him, a dry, creaking sound he seemed surprised to find he still owned. The man who had been alone with $40 in a coffee can found his kitchen full of people who would not leave, and he sat in the middle of it, looking dazed and young, like a man who had walked out of a cold so long that he had forgotten warmth was a thing that could happen to him. Daniel stayed. He had not announced it. He simply did not leave. And one morning he realized he had been in Cedar Falls longer than he had been anywhere since the Corps, and that the realization brought no urge to run with it. Theo offered him work at the welding shop, real work, steady, and Daniel took it. He found a room to rent above Ruth's feed store, cheap, with a window that looked out over the main street, and Bishop claimed the patch of morning sun on the floorboards as his own. He drove out to Henry's place most evenings. The old man was getting stronger. The spring that never went dry still ran clear at the bottom of the property, and on the first warm day of early spring, the 2 of them walked down to it slow, Henry leaning on a cane and Daniel matching his pace, with Bishop ranging ahead and circling back the way he always did, never more than a few yards off. "You never did. Correct me," Henry said, watching the dog. "First day I called him Scout. You never said a word. Didn't seem like the moment," Daniel said. "His name's Bishop. I know that now." Henry stopped and looked at the dog a long moment. "But I'll tell you what I think, and you can take it or leave it. I think there's a thing that gets passed down, a way of standing between trouble and the people who can't stand up for themselves. My Scout had it. This one's got it." He looked at Daniel, and his eyes were clear and steady. Quote, "And so do you, son, whether you've made your peace with it or not." Daniel did not answer. End quote. I, I, pre. He looked down at the spring running clear, over the stones, water that had been running there since before his grandfather was born, and would run there after. And he felt the pressure that had lived in his chest for years ease in a way he had no words for. He had spent so long believing that staying was a thing that trapped you. He understood now that he had been moving, so he would never have to find out what he was made of when he stopped. The dog had stopped first. The dog had walked into a building they had never seen and lain down across a stranger's door, and in doing it had refused, for the first time in 4 years, to follow Daniel anywhere. He understood now that Bishop had not been disobeying him. The dog had been showing him the way. He had been waiting with that patient, amber-eyed look for the man to catch up. On a Sunday in April, with the bottomland greening and the spring loud with snowmelt, the people who had built that rescue gathered at Henry's place for no reason except that they wanted to. Ruth brought too much food. Theo brought a folding table and an argument about the right way to grill. Sam Whitlock came with his wife. Pauline came in jeans instead of scrubs and laughed more than Daniel had ever heard her. Gerald Voss came and stood a little apart at first, the way a man does when he is still forgiving himself, until Henry walked over and shook his hand and would not let it go, and after that he was one of them. Daniel stood at the edge of the yard with a plate he had not touched and watched the thing he had been running from his whole life arrange itself in front of him in the shape of a crowded yard on a spring afternoon, a found family, a place. People who knew his name and the dog's name and would notice if either of them disappeared. It was the thing he had been most afraid of. And it turned out to be the only thing he had ever wanted. Bishop lay in the grass at Henry's feet, in the warm sun, his old legs stretched out easy, and the old man's hand rested on his head the way it had rested there in a dim hospital room when neither of them was sure there would be more days. The dog's eyes were half closed. He had found what he came for. He had known it before any of them, before Daniel, before the doctors, before the man even had a name. He had smelled something across a parking lot that none of them could smell, something that ran deeper than scent, and he had refused to leave it, and a whole life had been built on the back of that refusal. Henry looked up, found Daniel across the yard, and lifted his coffee cup a few inches in a small private salute. Daniel raised his own. Neither of them said anything. They did not need to. There is a kind of loyalty that does not ask whether it knows you. It simply sees what you are worth and stands its ground. A dog showed that to a room full of people who had nearly forgotten it was real, and in showing it, he gave one wandering man a home, and one forgotten man a future, and one whole town a story to keep. If you have ever felt like a stranger in your own life, like the kind of person nobody would sit beside a closed door for, I want you to remember Henry Calloway, who woke up alone and was not alone for long because goodness, it turns out, still shows up. It shows up with tools and food and stubborn old women carrying clipboards. Sometimes it shows up on 4 legs and lies down across a door and will not move. May God keep you and the people you love. May there be someone who refuses to leave when you need them most, and may you have the courage, when your own moment comes, to be the one who stays. Thank you for staying to the end of this one.